The deal, valued at $100 million, was dying a slow, suffocating death in the velvet-draped quiet of Le Celeste's most exclusive private room. On one side of the vast, polished rosewood table sat Bradley Thorne, a real estate titan whose ambition was matched only by his vulgarity. He was a man built of sharp angles and loud fabrics, his voice a percussive instrument designed to bludgeon conversations into submission. Beside him, his junior associate, a nervous young man named Kevin, shifted and fidgeted, a pale moon orbiting a loud, obnoxious sun. On the other side of the table was the reason for the impasse, Monsieur Jean-Pierre Dubois. He was a relic from another era, a man in his late 70s with a wisp of fine white hair and eyes the color of a faded summer sky. His suit, a simple dark wool, was likely older than Thorne himself, yet it hung on his frail frame with an elegance that money couldn't buy. He was the patriarch of Dubois Parfum, a century-old French institution, a dynasty built on lavender fields in Provence and the alchemical magic of scent. He had not spoken a single word of English all evening. They saw his silence as senility, his quiet French murmurs to his aid as the ramblings of a man lost to time. Thorne smirked. He gestured with his fork. He spoke with the patronizing slowness one might use for a child, convinced he was the master of this universe. He believed he was in complete control. What he didn't know was that his every condescending bellow, his every whispered, greedy aside to Kevin, was being absorbed and understood by the one person in the room they had ceased to see as human. They never even noticed the waitress. The air in the salon privé of Le Celeste was thick with the scent of roasted squab, aged Bordeaux, and curdled patience. It was an atmosphere of forced civility stretched thin over a chasm of cultural contempt. The room was a monument to old New York wealth, walls paneled in dark, glossy cherry wood, a small Renoir study gracing one wall, and a single floor-to-ceiling window that offered a breathtaking, godlike view of Central Park. Its lights, a scattered carpet of diamonds against the encroaching dark. Bradley Thorne was the antithesis of the room's quiet grace. He was new money, loud money, money that announced its presence with a diamond-encrusted watch and a laugh that sounded like rocks in a blender. His face was a perpetual florid pink, the result of high blood pressure and expensive scotch. He was here to finalize the purchase of the Dubois building on Fifth Avenue, the longtime American headquarters of the perfume house. It was a pre-war architectural gem, a place Thorne intended to gut and transform into another glass and steel monument to himself. Across from him, Jean-Pierre Dubois was a portrait of stillness. He moved with a deliberate economy of motion, his hands, spotted with age, resting calmly on the table. His face, a roadmap of fine wrinkles, was a mask of polite neutrality, but his pale blue eyes held a deep, profound weariness. Next to him sat his aide, Luc, a severe-looking man in his 40s who translated Thorne's bluster into sterile, clipped French. The problem had begun the moment they sat down. After the initial, stilted greetings, Thorne had launched into his typical, full-frontal assault of bonhomie in business. "Jean-Pierre, my friend, it's a pleasure, a real pleasure. We're going to do great things." "Great things," Thorne had boomed, clapping his hands together. Luc had leaned in and murmured to Dubois. The old man had responded with a single soft, melodic sentence. "Monsieur Dubois is pleased to be here, and thanks you for your hospitality," Luc translated, his own English flawless and devoid of emotion. The dinner had proceeded as a painful exercise in miscommunication. Thorne would deliver a monologue on market share, disruptive innovation, and maximizing square footage, which Luc would condense into a terse whisper. Dubois would reply with a short, often poetic phrase, which Luc would then strip of all its soul and deliver back to Thorne. "Tell him the new zoning permits are a slam dunk. We'll have the demolition crews in by Christmas," Thorne would say, slicing into his filet mignon with savage enthusiasm. Luc's translation: "He speaks of the demolition permits." Dubois' reply, a quiet murmur looking out the window: "Les arbres du parc. Ils se souviennent de plus d'hiver que nous n'en verrons jamais." The trees in the park. They remember more winters than we will ever see. Luc's translation back: He is acknowledging the timeline. It was like trying to describe a sunset using only the words black and white. Thorne's patience, never a deep well, was running dry. He leaned toward Kevin, his voice a stage whisper that carried easily across the table. "What's with this guy? Is he all there? For 100 mil, you'd think he could learn a few words of English. This is America, for God's sake." Thorne's smile was a tight, predatory thing. "Just play along, Kevin. We're dealing with a living fossil. The prize is the building, not his friendship. Just keep him placid until he signs." But it felt like more than a game to Jean-Pierre Dubois. His tired eyes, which seemed to see everything, followed Thorne's every crude gesture. He rarely looked at Luke as he translated, but instead watched the two Americans, his gaze unwavering and deeply analytical. It was unnerving. Occasionally, he would address Thorne directly, a stream of gentle French that sounded like a question, his head tilted slightly. Each time, Thorne would look blankly at Luke for the answer. "He asks if your family has a long history in the city of New York, Monsieur Thorne." Luke would translate, his face a stony mask. Thorne would bark a laugh. "History? I make history, pal. My father sold insurance in Queens. I own 3 blocks of Midtown. That's the only history that matters." He was being dissected, his character weighed and measured, and the man holding the scales was speaking a language that rendered Thorne utterly impotent. His frustration was fermenting into a dangerous arrogance. He was the king of this city, not some dusty old Frenchman. This was his restaurant, his deal. He was being made to feel small, and Bradley Thorne did not do small. Amelia Russo, known to everyone as Mia, adjusted the starched white apron at her waist. Her movements were a silent ballet she had perfected over 2 years of working at La Celeste, a ghost in the machine of haute cuisine. Her job was to be invisible, an extension of the restaurant's will. Refill a water glass the moment it dropped by a quarter. Clear a bread plate with the soundless grace of a falling leaf. To exist as a pair of hands, not a person with thoughts, dreams, and a mountain of student debt. But Mia was a watcher. It was how she had navigated the world since she was a little girl. She noticed things. She saw the slight, almost imperceptible tremor in Kevin's hand as he reached for his water, a clear sign of a young man terrified of his boss. She saw the way Bradley Thorne's expensive, easy smile was a cheap veneer over a core of brutish impatience. Most of all, she watched Jean-Pierre Dubois. To Thorne, the old man was an obstacle, a bizarre foreign relic. To Mia, he was something else entirely. He was a song she hadn't heard in years. Mia was a history major at Columbia, specializing in post-war European reconstruction, but her real education hadn't come from textbooks. It had come from her grandmother, her mémé. Sophia Russo was a war bride, a young woman from a small, sun-drenched village near Grasse, the heart of French perfume country. She had met an American GI in the summer of '45, fallen in love, and followed him back to a new life in a small town in upstate New York. For 22 years, Mémé had filled Mia's childhood with the sounds and smells of a world she'd left behind. She had taught Mia French, not the crisp, formal French of Paris, but the softer, more lyrical dialect of Provence, a language scented with lavender and thyme, a language full of ancient sayings and a deep, abiding respect for the past. French wasn't a second language to Mia. It was the language of lullabies, of fairy tales, of whispered family secrets. It was the language she still spoke with her mémé on the phone every Sunday. Now working grueling hours to pay for a degree that felt more and more like an impossible luxury, those days seemed a lifetime away. Here she was just Mia, the quiet waitress. No one knew that the soft, flowing words spoken by Monsieur Dubois were as clear as day to her. And what she heard was breaking her heart. She heard Luke's translations, and they were technically correct. But they were skeletons without flesh, notes without music. They lacked the soul, the subtle inflections, the layers of meaning woven into every word Dubois spoke. When Dubois had asked about Thorne's family history, his phrasing hadn't been a simple question. It was a gentle probe for connection, for roots, for a sense of shared stewardship of a city. The French phrase he used, une longue histoire, implied a legacy, not just a timeline. Thorne's boorish response had been a slap in the face. She watched as Thorne, growing bolder with his frustration, decided to treat Dubois as if he were hard of hearing. "We are offering a very good price," he said, articulating each word with exaggerated slowness, holding up his fingers as if counting for a toddler. "Lots of money." Mia physically flinched, the insult so profound, so deeply ignorant, she felt a hot flush of shame on Thorne's behalf. She saw Jean-Pierre Dubois' eyes for a fraction of a second flicker with something that looked like immense pain. Not anger, but a deep, weary sorrow for what the world was becoming. Luke's jaw tightened, but he remained a stone wall, translating Thorne's oafish words dutifully. Dubois responded, his voice still quiet, but with a new edge of steel beneath the velvet. Luke translated, "Monsieur Dubois understands the financial offer." But what Dubois had actually said was, "Dites à cet homme que le bruit d'une mouche a plus de substance que ses paroles." Tell this man that the buzzing of a fly has more substance than his words. Mia nearly dropped the heavy silver water pitcher she was holding. She steadied herself against the paneled wall, her heart hammering against her ribs. This wasn't a business negotiation. It was a slow-motion car crash. This man, in his blind, arrogant pursuit of a building, was demolishing a century of dignity, and Dubois was letting him. He was observing the disrespect, cataloging it, his silence a vast, empty canvas onto which Thorne was gleefully painting his own boorish portrait. The final straw came when Thorne, now utterly convinced that the man across from him was a doddering fool, decided to discuss his true intentions openly with Kevin. "Look, this is going nowhere," Thorne muttered, leaning across the table, treating Luke and Dubois as if they were pieces of furniture. "Let's just get to the signing. Once the ink is dry, we gut the place. I mean a total teardown of the interior. That ridiculous lobby with the old perfume bottles? Gone. The archives he's so sentimental about in the sub-basement? We'll have it all carted off to a dump in Jersey. He's got some clause in here about preserving the historical character. We'll just tie that up in legal challenges until he gives up or dies, whichever comes first. He'll never know what hit him." Kevin paled but nodded sycophantically. "Brilliant, Brad. He's just a sentimental old fool." Mia stood frozen by the service station, the cold marble counter pressing into her back. They were going to defraud him, right in front of him, using his own language as a shield for their contempt. They assumed his inability to speak English equated to an inability to comprehend, to reason, to feel. They saw a frail old man, not a titan of industry. They saw a foreigner, not a founder. And in that moment, Mia felt the 22 years of her grandmother's stories rise up in her. Stories of the war, of resilience, of the quiet dignity of her people who had endured so much. She remembered her mémé telling her that, in France, a man's legacy wasn't just in the money he made, but in the beauty he created and the honor with which he lived. Silence, her mémé taught her, was often a sign of strength, of deep thought. It was not a vacuum to be filled with noise and greed. She looked at Jean-Pierre Dubois' face, at the profound, lonely intelligence in his eyes. It was the same look she'd seen in her mémé's eyes when her grandfather passed away. A person surrounded by people who saw only frailty, not the pillar of strength within. Her manager's voice echoed in her head. "You are invisible, Mia. Do not speak to the guests unless spoken to. Ever." It was the cardinal rule. Breaking it meant instant dismissal. It meant her tuition payment would bounce. It meant her dream of being a historian, of preserving the very kind of legacy Thorne sought to destroy, would evaporate into the unforgiving New York night. But then she heard Jean-Pierre Dubois speak again, his voice almost a whisper, a soft murmur not directed at anyone but the universe itself. "N'y a-t-il donc personne ici qui se souvienne de ce que signifie l'honneur? Is there, then, no one here who remembers what honor means?" Mia's decision was made. Her job, her tuition, her future. They felt small, insignificant, compared to the colossal injustice unfolding in this gilded cage. She pushed off from the service station, smoothed her apron with trembling hands and walked toward the table, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. As Mia approached the table, the world seemed to contract. The ambient sounds of the restaurant, the distant clatter of plates, the murmur of other diners, fading into a dull, roaring hum in her ears. Each step on the plush Aubusson carpet was a deliberate, terrifying act of rebellion. All that existed were the four men at the table, locked in their tableau of deception. Thorne and Kevin didn't even register her presence at first, too engrossed in their smirking conspiracy. Luke's head was bowed, his face a mask of weary resignation. Only Jean-Pierre Dubois' eyes, those tired, pale blue oceans of history, lifted to meet hers. For a fleeting second, Mia saw a flicker of surprise in them, a momentary crack in his stoic facade. She stopped not beside Thorne, the source of the poison, but at a respectful distance from Monsieur Dubois' side of the table. She took a slow, deep breath, the filtered, refrigerated air feeling thin and inadequate in her lungs. This was it, the precipice. She inclined her head, not the perfunctory nod of a server, but a small, formal bow of respect. A gesture her meme had taught her was reserved for elders and those one held in high esteem. The movement was so unexpected, so out of place, that it sliced through the room's toxic tension like a blade. Thorne and Kevin stopped talking, their heads snapping in her direction. "What the hell is this?" Thorne barked, his face twisting into a sneer of irritation. "We need more wine here, sweetheart, not a floor show." His voice trailed off as Mia straightened up, looked directly at Jean-Pierre Dubois and spoke. Her French was flawless. It was not the sterile, academic French of a classroom, but the warm, nuanced dialect of Provence, formal and humble, yet clear as a bell in the silent room. "Monsieur Dubois," she began, her voice steady despite the hurricane in her chest. "Pardonnez mon audace impardonnable. Je ne suis qu'une simple servante. Mais rester silencieuse face à un tel manque de respect souillerait l'honneur de cette maison, et le mien. Forgive my unforgivable audacity. I am but a humble servant here. But to remain silent in the face of such disrespect would stain the honor of this house and my own." The silence that followed was absolute, a stunned, deafening void. Thorne and Kevin stared at her, their mouths literally hanging open. It was as if a silver candlestick had suddenly begun to recite poetry. This girl, the one who had been a silent fixture in the background, the one they hadn't given a second thought to, was speaking the very language that had been their impenetrable barrier all evening. Luke's head shot up, his eyes wide with disbelief. He looked from Mia to Dubois, his professional composure completely shattered for the first time. But the most profound reaction came from Jean-Pierre Dubois himself. The weary, impassive mask he had worn all night didn't just crack, it crumbled. His eyes, which had held a universe of lonely wisdom, welled up. A single crystalline tear escaped and traced a slow path down the wrinkled landscape of his cheek. His lips parted slightly, and a small, choked sound emerged from his throat. A sound of immense, soul-shattering relief. It was the sound of a man who, after wandering lost in a desert of vulgarity, had just stumbled upon an oasis. He responded to Mia, his own voice thick with an emotion that had been absent all evening. Vous comprenez? He asked, his words a fragile whisper. You understand? Vous comprenez le sens derrière les mots? You understand the meaning behind the words? Je comprends tout, monsieur, Mia replied, her own voice gaining strength from his réaction. Ma grand-mère est de Grasse. J'entends non seulement vos paroles, mais aussi votre cœur. I understand everything, sir. My grandmother is from Grasse. I hear not only your words, but your heart. This exchange, lasting no more than 15 seconds, completely detonated and reassembled the power structure of the room. Thorne and Kevin were no longer the puppet masters. They were outsiders, locked out of a conversation that was suddenly flowing with more genuine meaning than anything they had managed in 2 hours. What is she saying? Thorne demanded, his voice sharp with suspicion and fury. He pointed a thick, accusatory finger at Mia. Who the hell are you? What did you just say to him? Mia did not look at him. Her attention remained entirely on Monsieur Dubois. She was no longer a waitress. She was a bridge, a sudden, unexpected link across a chasm of cultural ignorance. Jean-Pierre Dubois, with that single tear still glistening on his cheek, gestured with a frail, elegant hand toward the empty chair beside him. It was both an invitation and a command. He spoke again, a short, clear sentence in French. Luke, finally finding his voice, translated for the bewildered Americans, though his eyes were fixed on Mia with a look of pure awe. Monsieur Dubois requests that the young lady join them at the table. Thorne scoffed, a strangled sound of disbelief. Join them? She's the damn waitress. This is insane. But Bradley Thorne, for all his bluster, was a man who understood power, and he could feel it shifting in the room as tangibly as a change in barometric pressure. The quiet old Frenchman was no longer a passive object. He had found a champion, an interpreter of the soul, and that champion was a girl in a white apron. Thorne fell silent, his face a mask of thunderous confusion, his mind racing to compute this impossible new variable. Mia hesitated for only a heartbeat. The world had just turned upside down. Then, with a quiet grace she didn't know she possessed, she pulled out the heavy rosewood chair and sat down. Seated at the magnificent table, the fine, heavy linen of the napkin feeling alien and undeserved in her lap, Mia felt a profound sense of unreality. The glittering crystal, the ornate silverware, the half-eaten plates of Michelin-starred cuisine, they were artifacts from a world she served, not one she inhabited. Yet the gaze of Jean-Pierre Dubois anchored her, imbued her with a sense of purpose that dwarfed her fear. Thorne and Kevin watched, their faces a thunderous mixture of outrage and bewilderment. This was a flagrant violation of every social and corporate protocol they had ever known. I think we deserve an explanation, Thorne finally managed to say, his voice a low, dangerous growl. He was addressing Luke, but his furious glare was fixed on Mia. What in God's name is going on? Before Luke could formulate a response, Monsieur Dubois addressed Mia directly in French, his voice now calm and infused with a quiet, resonant authority. Mia listened intently, her head tilted, nodding slightly. Then she turned her gaze to the two American executives. For the first time, she spoke to them directly, her English clear and measured. My name is Amelia Rousseau. Monsieur Dubois has asked me to clarify the situation for him. She paused, letting the simple, earth-shattering statement land. He feels it is time for you to understand the full context of this meeting and of his silence. Luke gave Mia a slow, almost imperceptible nod of assent. He recognized in that moment that his role as a detached professional interpreter was no longer sufficient. What was needed now was not translation, but transmission of culture, of dignity, of truth. Mia turned back to Monsieur Dubois, who began to speak in French. He didn't speak of business, of contracts or demolition permits. He spoke of his father, who founded the company after the Great War, a man who believed that creating perfume was not a business, but a sacred trust, the art of capturing memory in a bottle. He spoke of the building on Fifth Avenue, purchased in 1948, not as a property asset, but as a promise to America, a symbol of Franco-American friendship and shared resilience after the darkness of the war. As Dubois spoke, Mia translated, her voice becoming a vessel for the old man's history and his pain. Monsieur Dubois' father survived Verdun, Mia began, her words painting a stark, poignant picture in the opulent room. He came home believing that the world needed to be reminded of beauty, of things that last. He saw perfume as a way to do that. The Dubois building was their embassy of beauty in the New World. It was the first thing his father bought when the company finally had the means. He saw it as a monument to hope. Thorne shifted uncomfortably. This is all very touching, but what does it have to do with the deal? Dubois continued in French, his voice tinged with sorrow. Mia's translation followed, sharp and clear. He says that for the past 2 hours, he has listened to you speak of this building, this symbol, as nothing more than square footage to be exploited. He has listened to you speak of his family's archives, a century of formulas and correspondence, as garbage to be hauled to a dump in New Jersey. The color drained from Thorne's face. Kevin looked as if he was about to be physically ill. They were caught, exposed. He has remained silent, Monsieur Thorne, not because he is senile or because he doesn't understand. Mia's voice was steady, but it carried the weight of Dubois' profound disappointment. He has been silent because he believes that a man's true character is revealed not in what he says, but in what he does when he believes no one of consequence is listening. He was giving you the space to reveal yourself, and you have done so with remarkable clarity. Mia took a breath, ensuring she conveyed the gravity of the final point exactly as Dubois was expressing it. He came here tonight not just to sell a building, but to pass on a stewardship. He needed to know that its legacy would be understood, if not cherished. He has discovered that you are not a steward. You are a gravedigger. A wave of humiliation so potent it was almost visible washed over Kevin. He stared down at his plate, unable to meet anyone's eyes. But shame was not a currency Bradley Thorne dealt in. He saw not a moral failure, but a tactical one. He had been caught. Now he had to fight his way out. His mind, ever the predator, was already shifting from condescension to aggression. "Now wait just a goddamn minute," he snarled, leaning forward, his affability vanishing, to reveal the brutish core beneath. "This is a business deal, $100 million deal. I'm not here for a history lesson from some washed-up French dandy and his waitress translator." He jabbed a finger at Mia again. You're fired, you understand me? You're finished. I'll make sure you never work in this town again." The threat, crude and direct, hung in the air. Mia felt a chill of genuine fear. He could do it. A man like him could crush a person like her without a second thought, a mere footnote in his relentless march to power. Monsieur Dubois listened to the outburst, his expression calm. He then looked at Mia, and in his eyes she saw a flicker of the same weary disappointment she had seen earlier, but now it was mixed with something else. Resolve. The test was over, and the results were in. The dinner was no longer a negotiation. It had become a reckoning. And Mia, the waitress, was now standing at its very heart, armed with nothing but her mémè's language and a terrifying, burgeoning sense of her own power. The air, which had briefly cleared with the bracing honesty of Dubois' feelings, was now thick with a new kind of poison, the raw, cornered fury of a bully exposed. Thorne, his face a mottled purple, was no longer trying to feign civility. He slid a heavy, leather-bound portfolio from his briefcase and slapped it down on the center of the table. The sound echoed like a gunshot in the tense silence. "This is our final offer," he snarled, his voice a low growl. "It's $105 million. That's $5 million more than we agreed. You sign it tonight, right now, and we forget this little theatrical performance." He shot a venomous glare at Mia. "It's a take-it-or-leave-it deal, and I'd advise you to take it. Finding another buyer for a dusty old relic like that building won't be easy." It was a power play, a crude attempt to use money as a bludgeon to erase the insult, to reassert his dominance. Monsieur Dubois looked at the portfolio but did not move to touch it. Instead, he gestured for Mia to examine it. She felt a knot of pure panic tighten in her stomach. She was a history student. She knew about the Treaty of Versailles and the fall of the Bastille, not about escrow accounts and liability waivers. But she had to try. She had to be more than just a voice. With trembling hands, she picked up the document. The paper felt cold and slick, filled with dense, impenetrable blocks of legal text. She began to read the key clauses aloud to Monsieur Dubois in French, her voice slow and careful, trying to translate not just the words but the potential implications. As she did, she could feel Thorne's eyes burning into her, his impatience a palpable force. "Clause 4, subsection C," Thorne interrupted, his voice dripping with condescension, "is just standard boilerplate about transfer of assets. Legal mumbo-jumbo. You can skip that. And Section 9, Kevin chimed in, eager to be useful, just outlines the transition of the ground floor retail leases. It's a formality." They were trying to steer her, to control the flow of information. But as Mia read, a phrase snagged her attention. She had spent enough late nights in the university library poring over dense academic texts to recognize the scent of deliberately obtuse language. "Un moment, s'il vous plaît," Mia said, holding up a hand to silence them before turning to Dubois and switching to French. "Monsieur," she whispered, her voice low and urgent, "they are glossing over these sections, but the language here is treacherous. Clause 4C isn't just about assets. It contains a rider that grants the new owner sole and unrestricted rights to all historical artifacts and archival materials found on the premises, classifying them as chattel with no monetary or historical value. They could legally sell your father's letters. Dubois' eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. The hand resting on the table clenched into a fist. He gave a slight, sharp nod for her to continue. And Section 9, Mia went on, her heart pounding with a mixture of terror and adrenaline, is not just about retail leases. It includes a provision for immediate structural assessment for purposes of modernization. Monsieur, this is the legal loophole for demolition. It gives him the power to declare the core of the building structurally unsound and gut it, bypassing the historical preservation clauses in the preamble. They are trying to get you to sign away not just your building, but its very soul. Mia was no longer just translating. She was analyzing, defending. With every deceptive clause she decoded, she felt a surge of righteous power. The two powerful men at the table suddenly seemed small, their expensive suits and loud voices nothing more than cheap camouflage for their bottomless greed. Thorne was becoming visibly agitated. What's the holdup? What are you telling him? Just tell him it's a standard agreement and to sign the damn thing. Mia met his furious glare, her own expression now one of cold, unyielding defiance. I am ensuring Monsieur Dubois understands the full and precise meaning of every clause, Mr. Thorne. As you can appreciate, clarity is paramount in a deal of this magnitude. Her formal corporate language, coming from a woman in a waitress's apron, seemed to stun him into momentary silence. Then at Dubois' quiet prompting, Mia posed a question, her tone deceptively simple. Monsieur Dubois is curious about Appendix B. He notes that the original offer included a significant endowment for the building's maintenance staff, some of whom have worked there for over 40 years. In this new offer, that appendix appears to be missing. Thorne waved a dismissive hand. It's a clerical oversight, a simplification. The overall number is bigger. That's all that matters. It's all factored in. Dubois spoke again, his French soft but carrying the unbending weight of forged steel. Mia's translation was precise and unforgiving. Monsieur Dubois says that, in his experience, when the livelihoods of loyal men and women become a clerical oversight, it is rarely for the sake of simplicity. He says that the honor of a man can be measured by how he treats those with less power. He finds your measure to be lacking. A single bead of sweat trickled down Bradley Thorne's temple. He and Kevin began to flip frantically through their copies of the document, a frantic rustling that was the only sound in the room. They were flustered, trapped. They had assumed their opponent was a doddering fool and his translator was a simple machine. They had never expected this surgical, informed dissection of their deceit. They had never expected Amelia Rousseau. Jean-Pierre Dubois sat back in his chair, a portrait of absolute calm. He took a delicate sip of his water. For the first time all evening, a tiny, almost imperceptible smile touched the corners of his lips. He was not the frail, confused old man they had tried to swindle. He was a lion, and he had just watched two hyenas walk confidently into a trap of their own making. Mia realized with a jolt that Dubois hadn't needed her to understand the contract. He had seen the traps himself. The aphasia of language had not been an aphasia of intellect. He had needed a witness. He had needed a voice not to translate the page, but to translate the character of the men in the room. The entire evening, his silence, his apparent confusion, his vulnerability, it had all been the most elaborate, high-stakes moral litmus test imaginable. And now it was time for the verdict. The atmosphere in the room had undergone a final, dramatic transformation. The cloying scent of predatory confidence had been burned away, replaced by the acrid, metallic smell of panic. Thorne and Kevin had abandoned all pretense of composure, their furious, panicked whispers echoing across the table as they failed to find justification for the devious clauses Mia had exposed. Jean-Pierre Dubois watched them for a long moment, his expression as unreadable as a marble bust. Then he looked at Mia and began to speak. His French was different now. The soft, lyrical tones of Provence were gone, replaced by a voice that was crisp, commanding, and utterly resolute. It was the voice of a patriarch, a captain of industry, a man who had built an empire and weathered storms Thorne couldn't even imagine. Mia listened, her eyes wide. The instructions were specific, the message devastatingly clear. She took a deep breath, straightened her back, and prepared to deliver the final, crushing blow. She turned to Thorne and Kevin, whose frantic whispering ceased as they saw the look on her face. "Gentlemen," Mia began, her voice ringing with an authority that was no longer borrowed but her own. "Monsieur Dubois has instructed me to convey his final decision." She let the words hang in the air, drawing out the silence until it was a tangible, uncomfortable weight. "First," Mia said, her gaze locking onto Thorne, "regarding your attempt to classify his family's historical archives as worthless chattel. Monsieur Dubois recognizes this as a blatant attempt to plunder his family's legacy. He considers this not just a breach of contract, but an act of profound cultural vandalism, an insult to the memory of his father." Thorne's florid face went pale, a blotchy, unhealthy white. "Second," Mia continued, turning her attention to the trembling Kevin, "regarding your clerical oversight that would have stripped the building's loyal staff of their security. Monsieur Dubois finds this to be the most revealing clause of all. He believes that a business built on the exploitation of the vulnerable is not a business, but a crime. He pities you for serving such a master." Kevin looked as if he had been physically struck, his face crumpling in shame. "And third," Mia said, her voice dropping slightly, addressing Thorne once more, "regarding your condescension, your arrogance, and your assumption that his silence was a sign of weakness. Monsieur Dubois wishes for me to tell you that he has done business with presidents, with titans of industry, with artists and kings. And in all his years, he has never encountered a man so small who tried so hard to seem so big." The two men were speechless, utterly eviscerated. They had been outmaneuvered, outsmarted, and morally flayed by the very man they had dismissed as a senile relic, and by the waitress they hadn't even seen. But the masterstroke was yet to come. Monsieur Dubois spoke one final time in French, a short, simple phrase directed at his aide, Luc. As he spoke, Luc, who had been a silent statue for the past hour, reached into his jacket pocket and produced a small, sleek digital audio recorder. He placed it on the table and pressed a button. Thorne's voice, tinny and distorted, filled the silent room. "Gut the place. I mean a total teardown. Archives. Carted off to a dump in Jersey. Tie that up in legal challenges until he gives up or dies, whichever comes first. He'll never know what hit him." Kevin's sycophantic reply followed, dripping with contempt. "Brilliant, Brad. He's just a sentimental old fool." The recording played their entire whispered conversation, every greedy, dismissive, and fraudulent word echoing in the opulent dining room, like a judgment from on high. When it finished, a profound, tomb-like silence descended. Bradley Thorne looked ashen, his expensive suit suddenly looking like a cheap costume on a broken mannequin. Kevin was staring at the recorder as if it were a coiled serpent about to strike. And then, the final, stunning act. Jean-Pierre Dubois looked across the table directly at Bradley Thorne. He leaned forward slightly, and in a voice that was quiet, raspy from disuse, but perfectly, chillingly clear, he spoke his first English words of the night. "I believe," he said, his French accent a faint, elegant melody, "that our business is concluded." The shock was absolute, a thunderclap in a silent church. He had understood, the whole time. Perhaps not every colloquialism, but he had understood the tone, the intent, the foul spirit of the negotiation from the very beginning. The French had not been a necessity. It had been a choice, a filter, a test. He stood up, his frailness transformed into a steely, regal posture. Luc held his chair. Monsieur Dubois turned to Mia. He did not smile, but he inclined his head in a gesture of immense, heartfelt gratitude, a shared victory between two defenders of the past. Then, without another glance at the two ruined men, he turned and walked out of the room, leaving behind the wreckage of $100 million deal and two careers that were, for all intents and purposes, finished. The sound of the door clicking shut was the loudest noise Mia had ever heard. Mia stood alone in the private dining room, a ghost in a gilded tomb. The silence left in Jean-Pierre Dubois' wake was not peaceful. It was a high-pitched ringing in her ears, the sound of her life teetering on a razor's edge. The rich aromas of the abandoned meal now seemed cloying and decadent, the smell of a world she had just spectacularly violated. Thorne and his ashen-faced associate had vanished in a whirlwind of panicked, furious muttering, leaving behind a tangible aura of disgrace. They had left everything, a briefcase agape, pens, and the fraudulent contract sitting squarely in the center of the table, a monument to their greed. The adrenaline that had sharpened her senses and steadied her voice began its cruel retreat, leaving a cold, trembling weakness in its place. She reached out and touched the back of the rosewood chair she had occupied. The wood was still warm. It was the only thing that felt real. What have I done? The question hammered against her ribs. The cardinal rule, the one branded into every server at La Celeste, screamed in her mind, "You are invisible. You are silent. You do not exist." She had not only existed, she had appointed herself judge, jury, and executioner. The service door swung open with a violent slam, and her manager, a severe man named Philippe, with a perpetually pinched face, stormed into the room. His face was a mottled shade of crimson, his eyes blazing with a fury that made Mia's blood run cold. "Russo!" he hissed, his voice a low, dangerous weapon. He didn't shout. It was far more terrifying. "Do you have any idea what you have just done?" Mia stood frozen, her hands clasped behind her back in a posture of ingrained servitude. "Monsieur Philippe, I can explain." "Explain?" He let out a short, incredulous laugh that held no humor. "Explain how you decided to abandon your post? How you took it upon yourself to sit down, with a guest in the middle of a private dinner? I have Bradley Thorne's chief of staff on the phone screaming so loud I'm surprised the crystal in here hasn't shattered. He's threatening to sue not just you, but this entire restaurant for breach of privacy, for unprofessional conduct, for God knows what else." He advanced on her, his polished shoes sinking menacingly into the plush carpet. "Our reputation is built on discretion, on silent, perfect service, and you in 10 minutes have potentially destroyed it. You are fired, of course, that is a given. But I assure you, you will be so blacklisted in this city, you won't be able to get a job washing dishes in a back alley diner. Pack your things, get out of my sight." Each word was a nail hammered into the coffin of her precarious New York life. Her tuition payment was due in 3 weeks. Her rent was already late. The dream of one day curating a museum exhibit, a life surrounded by the quiet dignity of history, dissolved into a terrifying vision of eviction notices and crushing debt. She had acted on principle, on a deep-seated sense of justice learned at her Mémé's knee, and this was her reward: ruin. As Mia opened her mouth to speak, though she had no words to offer, the dining room door opened again, this time with a soft, deliberate click. A man stepped inside. He was in his late 60s, impeccably dressed in a tailored suit that spoke of quiet, generational wealth. He had been dining alone at a corner table all evening, an unobtrusive presence. Mia had refreshed his water twice, barely registering him. "Now," he commanded the room. "I believe you are mistaken," the man said. His voice was calm, yet it carried an authority that sliced through Philippe's tirade. He looked at the sputtering manager. Miss Russo was not acting on her own accord. She was providing a service of immense value, one that this establishment was clearly incapable of offering. Philippe blinked, his momentum broken. Who are you?" "My name is Arthur Vance," the man said simply. "I'm a senior partner at Cromwell and Swain, and I happen to be a witness to the entire evening's proceedings." He took a step into the room, his gaze fixed on Philippe. "As for Mr. Thorne, I would advise him to be very careful about making threats. I also happened to overhear his conversation regarding his intent to commit what sounds suspiciously like contractual fraud. My firm would be more than happy to discuss the matter with him, or with the district attorney." The color drained from Philippe's face. The name Cromwell and Swain was legendary in New York legal circles. The manager's theatrical rage collapsed into nervous obsequiousness. Vance's attention then shifted from the stunned manager to Mia. The cold, lawyerly precision in his eyes vanished, replaced by a genuine warmth and a profound look of respect that felt more valuable than any paycheck. That was the single bravest and most decent thing I have seen in a place like this in 20 years, he said quietly. Are you all right? Mia could only nod, her throat tight with unshed tears. I imagine you won't be finishing your shift, Vance said with a slight wry smile. He pulled a card from his wallet. You were just wrongfully terminated in a hostile environment. That means you'll need a lawyer. My services are at your disposal, pro bono. Call me tomorrow. We'll discuss your severance from this place, and then we can discuss your future. He didn't wait for an answer. He gave a final, dismissive look at the mortified Philippe and held the door open for Mia. She walked past her former manager, who stood gaping like a fish, his authority utterly dismantled. She didn't look back. She walked through the bustling main dining room, where other staff paused to stare, whispering behind their hands. She was a curiosity, a scandal in motion. She felt their eyes on her as she shed her white apron, folding it neatly and placing it on a service counter. A final symbolic act of leaving that world behind. She followed Arthur Vance out of the gilded restaurant and into the cool, damp night air of Manhattan. The following week was a blur of surreal conversations. True to his word, Arthur Vance handled everything. A single call from his office to Le Celeste's owners resulted in a terrified, apologetic phone call to Mia from Philippe, along with a severance package that was more money than she'd ever seen in her bank account at one time. Another call dealt with the blustering threats from Thorne's office, which evaporated the moment the words wire fraud and audio recording were mentioned. Mia found herself in Vance's corner office, a sun-drenched space overlooking the Statue of Liberty, feeling like a misplaced character in a movie. He had asked her about her studies, her grandmother, her ambitions. He listened with an intensity that made her feel, for the first time since she'd arrived in the city, truly seen. Character is a rare commodity, Mia, he told her, swirling the ice in a glass of water. People talk about it, but few are willing to pay the price for it. You were willing to lose everything for what was right. That's not something you can learn in law school. Then he arranged a video conference. On the screen, looking tired but serene from his study in Paris, was Jean-Pierre Dubois. Mademoiselle Rousseau, he began, his voice warm. Amelia, I owe you a debt that I can never truly repay. You did not just save my family's building. You saved a part of my faith in the world. He went on to explain. The encounter with Thorne had been the final straw in a long, wearying battle against a modern world he no longer understood. He was officially retiring. He was tired of fighting men who saw spreadsheets where he saw soul. But his work wasn't done. The Dubois Legacy Foundation, he explained, his eyes bright with a new passion, is my true legacy. We work to preserve historical architecture and support young artisans who still believe in craftsmanship, in beauty, in things made by hand. It is a small foundation, but its mission is my heart. He looked at her, his gaze direct and piercing, even through the screen. I find myself in need of a person of rare character in New York, someone to be my eyes and ears, someone who understands that the value of a thing is not always its price. This is not a grand offer, not a directorship. It is a beginning, a position as a program associate, to learn the work, to help us find the artisans and the buildings worth saving. Your first task, he added with a soft smile, would be to help us find a new American headquarters, one with a soul. The offer was overwhelming in its simple grace. It wasn't just a job, it was a purpose, a chance to turn her passion for history into a living, breathing mission. Your university studies, Monsieur Dubois continued, will not be an obstacle. The foundation will consider it a professional asset. We will underwrite the remainder of your degree. We believe a historian's eye is precisely what we need. Mia's mind was reeling. Her tiny apartment with its leaky faucet, the mountain of student loans, the constant, grinding anxiety of just trying to survive. Monsieur Dubois was offering to wipe it all away with a few sentences. But it was so much more than that. It was an invitation to step out of the shadows, to use her quiet observer's nature not as a shield, but as a tool. Why me? Mia whispered, the question born of a lifetime of feeling ordinary. I'm a student, a waitress. I'm nobody. It was Arthur Vance who answered, leaning forward in his chair. You're not a nobody, Mia. You're the person who was willing to stand up to a bully when everyone else in the room, myself included, was content to just watch the show. In my world and in Monsieur Dubois', that makes you the most important somebody there is. Tears welled in Mia's eyes, not of sadness or fear, but of a profound, overwhelming sense of belonging. The years of being a quiet watcher, of feeling like a ghost in her own life, had not been for nothing. It had all been training for this single, life-altering moment. She took a deep, shaky breath, the air in the quiet, powerful office feeling charged with her future. She looked from Arthur Vance's kind, shrewd face to Jean-Pierre Dubois' image on the screen, seeing not a lawyer and a tycoon, but a mentor and a kindred spirit. A new door was opening, and she knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her soul, that she had to walk through it. "Yes," Mia said, her voice clear and strong. "Yes, Monsieur Dubois. I would be honored." A brilliant, beautiful smile spread across the old man's face. "Jean-Pierre," he corrected gently. "From now on, you will call me Jean-Pierre." 6 months later, Mia stood on a dusty sidewalk in Soho, looking up at a magnificent cast-iron building from the 1880s. It was neglected, its windows grimy, and its facade in need of care. But it had an undeniable soul. It had history. Beside her, an architect was pointing out the original tin ceilings visible through the grimy windows. She was no longer a waitress serving the powerful. She was on a mission to preserve beauty, her notebook filled with plans and possibilities. Every Sunday, she still called her Mémé, and their conversations, now a mix of Provençal French and excited English, were filled with stories of her new life. A life she had earned not by being invisible, but by choosing, for one terrifying, glorious moment, to be seen. The journey was just beginning.